This is the Pont Cyswllt Aqueduct in North Wales. Designed by engineers Thomas Telford and William Jessup, it opened in 1805 after 10 years of construction and carries the Llangollen Canal over the River Dee in a valley 38 metres below. It is the longest aqueduct in Britain and the highest aqueduct in the world. From the mid-1700s onwards, the canals were the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution. With roads being poor and railways having not yet been invented, canals gave factories the only practical way to move large quantities of goods around, receiving raw materials and sending out their finished products to the ports for export around the world. Around 4,000 miles of canal were built in Britain at that time. It was absolutely critical to Britain's industrial success. When the canal builders needed to pass over this valley, they originally considered a long series of locks. But Telford had built an aqueduct before, albeit much smaller, and was confident the same concept would work here. Standing on 18 stone pillars and spanning 307 metres, the aqueduct trough is cast iron and weighs over 750 tonnes. Nowadays the canals are largely used for leisure and some people live aboard. But, being over 200 years old, the aqueduct needs regular maintenance to keep it in use, and every 20 years the trough is drained for a full inspection.
It was last dewatered in 2003-2004. Since then we've inspected the outside of the structure using drones, the underside using a camera mounted and reaching underneath from a boat. But this is the first time in 20 years we'll have seen the bolts in the bottom of the trough.
The whole point of this dewatering is a two-phase operation. So one, we've got a full inspection team coming on inspecting the 11,000 bolts and the stays. I think it's a part of it. That'll give us an idea and a pattern of almost a shopping list what we do. So we'll dewater again in 2 to 3 years' time. That'll give us enough time to make the materials out of traditional wrought iron or steel, whatever we find. Get the permissions from the CADU, who looks after the structure along with us, and get permissions and to make sure that everything's in place ready for the next dewater. You know, we will probably be repairing some work on the towpath, replacing the bolts to look after her.
And there are several thousand of those bolts holding together the 200 cast iron troughs that make up the base of the waterway. Onto those are bolted the side panels.
Essentially, this is a very large Meccano set, really. It was kind of made as a Meccano set, and it was built to be bolted together on site. You think about transporting these types of materials around any distance, it would have been very difficult. So you see lots of plates and plate numbers, and you see lots of component parts that were all built as the aqueduct was being built. It was a very big Meccano set, is how I often describe it.
Cast iron is the carbon fibre of its day compared to the size of the structure if it had been built in stone. If you go to Chirk Aqueduct further downstream, you'll see that it's twice as wide, twice as heavy, and probably twice as expensive. The bolts are wrought iron, and wrought iron is much more durable than steel. Steel's stronger, but you need a paint system to protect it. And the boats, the narrow boats and their propellers, grip blast these bolts, and Thomas Telford wouldn't have allowed for that. He'd have expected it to be horse-drawn boats on the towpath.
We've got bolts here that are from 2000. We've got bolts that are 200. You can clearly see, okay, that's been in for 200 years. So the erosion it's done, all right, over a period of 200 years is, it may have taken a flake down for about 10 or 15 or 20 mil. That's 200 years. So then you look at another bolt and think, that's going to be good for another 100 years. So it's basically by eye and by feel, by looking at one bolt that's been 200 and one that's been recently, say, whoa, if that's 200 years old and it's still looking pretty good, all right, but then you've got different bolts because everything was cast differently then. So some are good. Quality control, going back in those, is not as good as quality control. So you can have good bolts and you can have bad bolts, and you can actually see that. You've got some bolts that, like I said, they've both been in for 200 years. One is done really, really well, but the other one is probably because the grade and the wrought iron for that time when it was cast wasn't quite right, or the mix wasn't quite right.
Given it was built 2 centuries ago, before the advent of modern sealants and glues and so on, you may well be wondering how they stopped the water from dripping out between the troughs, because with the best will in the world, bolting iron together doesn't necessarily make a watertight seal.
They used a number of jointing techniques. Welsh flannel and white lead I mentioned. Also sugared lead and a concoction of materials. We generally would use oakum, which is hemp rope with tar packed into the joints, which is what you'd use on a heritage building, and that supplies a joint the same as you would on a timber ship.
Holding the whole thing up are those pillars, hollow at the top to save weight, made with stone from a local quarry. It's a very coarse but hard-wearing sandstone, which the Canal and River Trust says is in very good condition still. A testament not just to Thomas Telford, but all the other skilled craftsmen who made this possible.
Telford wasn't even 40 when he built this structure. But actually, he conceived it and designed it. He very rarely turned up here. The guys that built it were really important individuals. One of them actually went to school with Thomas Telford. So he was a good friend of Thomas Telford. So a gentleman called Matthew Davidson, who was the clerk of works or the superintendent on this site. Then you had two masons. You had John Simpson, the initial mason who built the piers, and then you had John Wilson, who was the secondary mason who supported building the piers. And then you have a gentleman, a very unsung hero, a gentleman called William Davis, who built the embankment on the other side of the aqueduct. And the embankment's often missed because it's a kind of significant part of the structure, but you don't really recognise it as a land work. And that's the bit that I think probably needs to be told, which is William Davis did a fantastic job in making sure that embankment stayed where it was.
But it's not just the Canal and River Trust who have responsibility here. The aqueduct is designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means it has the same protected status as the Taj Mahal. Such worldwide interest makes maintenance a little more complicated.
It's complex for lots of reasons. It's a structure that's in CRT ownership. We own the structure. It's what I often describe as the largest flying freehold in England and Wales, which is we own the structure but we don't own the land underneath it. But it's also we share the responsibility of caring for it with the Welsh State through Cadw. So in a sense there are lots of stakeholders, people who have vested interest in the structure that we have to manage in some respects, and we have to manage how we deal with it ourselves, but we also have to bring those groups of people along with us to ensure that it's managed or refurbished or renovated or conserved in the right way.
We've also got to maintain the habitat, so everybody who look for the bats, look for the swifts, they look for anything that makes this their home. So we have a duty and responsibility to not only the heritage but also the environmental side of things. So we mentioned about the water. When we do water, we mentioned the actual water on the Llangollen Canal actually provides water for 70,000 homes further down. So that has to be maintained, the flow of the water to that. That's where we work with United Utilities. United Utilities have got permission to pump water from the River Dee up to the other side on the frontage side, as they call it, to literally maintain the water supply for the canal and drinking water.
I have boated along this aqueduct before, but to walk along the actual floor of it with all the water out is a most peculiar sensation. In fact, it was about 4 years ago that I joined my friends Anna and Kath when they took their boat over the aqueduct. The back deck of a narrowboat, where you stand to steer, is on a level with the edge. You could, if you were careless, step out into nothing, though incredibly there's no record of any boaters ever having come to grief this way. What may also be slightly alarming, if you've ever walked over the towpath, is that path isn't to one side of the water, but right over it, held up by metal rods. When the time comes to drain the aqueduct, it's blocked off from the rest of the canal by use of wooden stop planks lowered into place at either end. In this instance, large pumps were used to empty the water, but there is actually another way. This metal hatch in the bottom of the trough is just like a bath plug. Pull it out, and the water glugs its way 38 metres down to the river below. Being permanently submerged, it's no surprise to find the plug and the lever used to pry it open needed a bit of restorative fettling, done here with the aid of a hammer, chisel, handsaw and a wire brush. Inevitably, all kinds of muck and rubbish finds its way to the bottom of the trough. I haven't seen one of these in years. The base plates may look a bit rough, Wouldn't you if you'd been underwater for 220 years? But after careful assessment, the engineers here reckon the so-called stream in the sky is doing very well.
Well, there are over 4,000 of these bolts. We wanted to look at the ones from 2004 that were replaced then, and what we've found is the degradation of those bolts has been minimal, if anything at all, and that gives us the confidence to say even the bolts that have deteriorated over the last 200 years are in good condition. There are one or two that we might need to replace in 20 or 40 years, but at the moment there are none we need to replace. We've got some works we need to go back in to do some works on this towpath. There are some elements, there's some angles that are wrought iron that are possibly from the 1960s that are due to be replaced. We've got some wrought iron, 7/8 inch wrought iron stays that are also corroding, and they've reached the end of their serviceable life and we'll need to replace them. And we're hoping to get back in a couple of years and replace those. So we've got temporary spacers in place with clamps that have been fixed so that they will give us a 2-year life, and then we'll come in and do a approved heritage repair and return it back to its original condition. And we're not just starting a maintenance regime now, it's been maintained since 1805 and it'll be maintained for the next 200 years or longer.
It may be looking good, but nonetheless costs around £150,000 a year in maintenance, prompting the CRT to launch a crowdfunding appeal for the immediate remedial works that need to be done to ensure the stream in the sky can continue to flow. Thanks for watching. Cheerio.